Hello, my name is Miss Holgarth and welcome to another revision session all about RUI. This time we will be covering imagery questions at National 5 level. As we go through this video, please pause at any point and attempt the questions or write some notes. Let's get started. How do we answer imagery questions? Well, we're going to go through the steps together one by one. Step 1 and Step 2 are much the same as any of the steps that we've discussed previously for answering Paper 1 of our RUI. You want to be able to read the question carefully. You should underline and highlight the relevant part of the question. In doing this, you can make a differentiation between if it is understanding in your own words or if you're looking for language or context. Nextly, you're going to find the relevant line or the relevant part of the passage in the text. You want to circle, highlight, indicate to yourself that you've found this. This means that you are not straying away from that line and losing your marks. Step 3 to 6 is what your answer should look like on the paper. So step 3. First, you're going to quote a piece of imagery that you've identified. State that is imagery. Step 4, you're going to describe the image that is being presented and how this connects to the passage. You're going to start this sentence by saying, just as. Step 4, after you've described the image, what you're going to do is you're going to describe the article and what it's trying to liken the image to. So the point of the article, the subject of the sentence, and why this is relevant to the question. You begin this sentence by saying, so too. Now step 6 is important. You've been asked to highlight the relevant part of the question. This is when step 6 comes in handy. You're going to link back to the relevant part of the question. Now, during this slideshow, you're going to see examples of answers. So if these steps are confusing you right now, please do not worry. The next part of the video is going to show you what an example answer should look like. Here is an example answer. So I have identified imagery like an overgrown child, and then I go on to just as. I need to describe the image, which is the child. So I say, just as a child acts with emotions immediately, devoid of logic, and does not communicate well on how to resolve this, I've done that. I found the connotations of what a child would act like and I've put them in. I now need to link it back to the subject of the paragraph, the subject of the sentence. So I say, so too does the shopper begin acting in a way that is not dignified and is clearly illogical. Now this would not be enough to get us a second mark. In National 5, you will get a mark for identification. You will get a mark for identifying like an overgrown child. But your second mark comes from the last bullet point. You want to be able to link back to the question well. By describing the shopper as a child, this shows the writer looks negatively on the shopper's actions. The writer believes there was an alternative way to react to the situation rather than respond in a hostile and unhelpful manner. So here is where we get our second mark. Let's go through the example questions together so we know how to look at a question and know if imagery is an acceptable answer. Question 4 says, look at lines 26 to 36 and then explain fully how the writer's use of language makes it clear that coping with performing under these circumstances is not easy. You should refer to 2 examples in your answer. The phrase writer's use of language will automatically stand out. This is a phrase that lets us know that we are going to be looking for language features such as imagery, tone, word choice, or sentence structure. We have a choice here, so we know that imagery is an option. Question 5 says, look at lines 31 to 35. By referring to 2 language features, explain how the writer makes clear his view about competition. And it then further specifies, it says, you should refer to 2 different features such as word choice, imagery, or sentence structure. As you can see here, the phrase language feature pops up again, as well as us saying that we need to look for imagery. Now question 2 is quite similar to question 4. It will be a little bit more vague in comparison to question 5. It says, look at lines 6 to 8. By referring to 1 example of language, explain how the writer makes clear that McDonald's was unfamiliar when it first came to the UK. So you can see it can be as little as 2 marks or as high as 4. And imagery, when the phrase says language, if it does not specify, is a completely acceptable answer to take. Which brings us to a top tip. If answering a generic language question, look for imagery, there will be at least one. Sometimes it can be the most straightforward to analyse and it will be able to get you the marks. What we're going to do now is we're going to try the first practice question together. It's from a past paper. Feel free to pause at any point in the video, take notes, answer the question yourself, but I will be going over the answers with you so we can have a look at it together. Practice 1 asks, look at lines 31 to 35. By referring to two language features, explain how the writer makes clear his view about competition. You should refer to two different features such as word choice, imagery, or sentence structure. Now, before we begin, it is good practice to identify all three when it's asked. In your prelim, you'll be expected to identify at least two of the three. But for this example, we're going to focus solely on imagery so that we're not getting confused. We go through the steps together. First, we need to underline or highlight the relevant part of the question. I know that I'm going to need to look at lines 31 to 35. And I know the question is all about how the writer makes clear his view about competition. So I need to find that passage in this huge article. So I'm not going to be overfaced. I'm not going to look at all of this writing and panic. I'm going to go straight to those lines and just focus on those lines alone, which I highlight. In the next slide, we're going to identify imagery within the lines. Feel free to pause before we go over the answer. It says, the majority, like Mark, never made it through the first lap. Others made it to the final straight before dropping out. But this is football. This is life. Failure is an inevitable aspect of any competition worthy of the name. Without losers, there cannot be winners. Without pain, there cannot be joy. Without natural selection, there cannot be evolution. Failure is not the opposite of progress. Failure is part and parcel of progress. Now, we only need to identify two examples of imagery because it's 4 marks. We know that we get a mark for identification and we know we get a mark for an acceptable and in-depth comment. So the first one I've identified is the first lap. The second one I've identified is the final straight. Now you can pause the video here and you can analyse these two by yourself and you can lay it out as so. But we're going to go over one by one the imagery answers. So the first lap, I've put the first lap. Just as the first lap in a competition is the easiest part and those who run it are full of energy, so too does it seem that it's shocking that these of who are full of energy in such a competitive environment don't make it through the supposed easiest part of the trial. And then I need to link it back. I say this shows how the writer makes clear that this competition between footballers during these trials are harder than anticipated. It's about competition. I have made sure I've linked back. Now feel free to look at your own answer and compare. We're going to go over where we're going to get the marks in comparison to the answer scheme after the next analysis. We are going to analyse the final straight of imagery now. The final straight. Just as the final straight in a race is the hardest, but a sign you've almost accomplished the competition, so try your hardest to finish, so too does it seem that regardless of footballers making it past the hardest part of the trial, they are still dropping out regardless of victory being in sight. I now need to link back to the point of the question, which is about how it makes his view about competition clear. This shows how difficult the trials are for young footballers who want to make it to the top. It highlights how draining the competition can be. As you can see, that is me attempting to successfully link back. You take both of those parts and you put it into an answer which will look like this. We're going to go over where we get the marks now. We're going to look at the SK marking scheme so that we can see the amount of choice that we had for imagery. The SQA marking scheme. Along the left-hand side of the screen is what the SQA look for when they're marking. As you can see, there's a word choice section as well as imagery because it's asked for both. If you are going to do this question in the exam, I do recommend using subheadings in order to separate your answers. But for this, we're only looking at imagery. So we're going to look at the first part of the imagery. There's a mention of a first lap here. We mentioned the first lap in our answer. We also successfully linked back because we talked about how the competition is harder than anticipated. So we get the mark. We get 1 mark for our quote and we get 1 mark for linking back. So far we have 2 out of 4. The next part, if you can see, it says final straight. We've identified that and we've successfully linked back because we see how it highlights how draining the competition can be. So we get 1 mark for the final straight and we get another mark for linking back as well as analysing successfully. This means that we are getting 4 out of 4 marks. Another top tip. If the question asks for imagery and one other technique, such as the previous one when there was mention of word choice, make sure to write subheadings for each language feature before your answer to make it clearer to the marker. If they're not searching for your answer, it means that they're not missing any of your great analysis, which means you're at a better chance to get full marks. Now we're going to go over practice 2. This is a higher practice paper, but the language should be acceptable for National 5 level. We're going to look and see where the imagery is and how we can analyse it together. If you want to pause at any point and try the question yourself, feel free. Practice 2 says, read lines 41 to 53. Analyse how the writer uses both imagery and sentence structure to criticise aspects of modern news. Feel free to stop the video now and highlight the relevant part of the question and the lines that you need to look for. What we're going to do is on the next slide, we're going to have isolated the lines we need to look for, which is 41 to 53. We're going to split up firstly. Then what we're going to do is we're going to analyse the imagery present. The paragraph says, there's no denying that in recent years, many news organisations have steered themselves away from public interest journalism and towards junk food news, chasing page views in hopes of attracting clicks, advertising or profit. And like junk food, you hate yourself when you've gorged on it. The most extreme version of this has been the creation of fake news farms, which attract traffic with false reports that are designed to look like real news and are therefore widely shared on social networks. We need to look at the first part of the imagery that we've identified. You can pause and find it yourself. I'm going to underline it now. I've identified that news is like junk food. I'm going to analyse the junk food now. Remember, it's about how we criticise aspects of modern news. I've said, like junk food, just as junk food is both addictive and bad for people in excess, as well as very easy to access, so too are people buying and reading news in excess, so much so that these stories are bad for people and easy to get a hold of. This shows the writer believes people are easily believing modern journalism and digesting it just as easily as they would junk food, not realising how bad it is for them in the long run. Just like junk food is addictive, so is modern journalism. This shows how the writer thinks modern news is a bad thing. As you can see, it's criticising aspects of modern news. I've linked that back in the final sentence when I say that modern news is a bad thing. Now we're going to go over the second piece of imagery that we've identified in the first paragraph. We highlight the second piece of imagery, which is fake news farms. My answer is, I've quoted fake news farms. Just as farm rears livestock and grows produce ready for all to be distributed at a high level and fast rate, so too does the media produce a high-level fake reports which are written at increasing speed and distributed very widely. This shows how the writer believes that these fake reports, with their intent to create a lot of attention, are negative due to the insincerity behind modern news stories. Again, the point of the question was criticising aspects of modern news. We have linked that by saying that modern news is insincere, hoping this will get us our second mark alongside the analysis. We're going to collate our answers together now. As you can see, this is what the answer paper would look like if you were aiming for 4 marks for an imagery answer. We have identified 2 quotes and we have analysed those 2 quotes, hoping to get a mark for each step. We're going to look at the SQA marking scheme now so that we can see how many marks we received. On the left-hand side, you can see the SQA marking scheme. Already we can see that we have identified junk food news as our answer. We've identified it, so at National 5 level, we would get a mark for the quote, and then we would get a mark for the analysis. It says here it needs to describe the worthlessness or the guilty pleasures of consuming the news. We've talked about that by saying it's bad for them, so we get the second mark. If you look at the third bullet point, it says fake news farms. We've identified that in ours by quoting, so we would get a mark. It says here that it suggests a large-scale production of news stories. We've talked about that and how it can be distributed very widely, so we would get our second mark. In total, we get a mark for each identification, we get a mark for each analysis and linking back, so we received 4 out of 4 marks. Well done if you also got 4 out of 4 marks and you tried it yourself. We are moving on to revision work now. You can pause and end the video here if you're very confident with the steps of imagery questions, or if you would like further practice, please watch on. Please pause at any point and answer the questions yourself. As always, I'm going to be going through the answers with you. Let's begin. Task 1 says, read the passage and answer the questions below. The question says, by referring to one example, show how the writer's imagery emphasises the writer's regret for throwing a house party. It's 2 marks. We know we only need to identify one piece of imagery. The passage says, he would never have a party again. They descended upon the house like wild animals, almost instantly consuming everything in their path before leaving it bare and lifeless after they left in search of another victim. I've identified like wild animals. I know this is a simile. It's definitely imagery. We're going to go over the answer together now. The answer, like wild animals I've quoted, that would be a mark. Now we analyse. Just as wild animals behave erratically in an unpredictable way, one which someone cannot control, so too does it seem the guests acted in a way the writer did not expect, and they treated the house as if it was an animal tearing apart its prey. It's clear, due to the state of the house, the writer regrets having a house party. Task 2 asks much the same. You're going to read the passage and answer the question below. The question reads, by referring to one example, show how the writer's imagery emphasises the importance of libraries. Again, it's 2 marks, so we know that we need to find one piece of imagery. We'll get a mark for identification, and then we'll get a mark for analysis. You can pause here, attempt the question yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to show you the imagery that I identify. The imagery is, it is a temple. We're saying the library is a temple. Libraries aren't temples. It is an image being described. We're going to analyse that now. I've quoted, it is a temple. Just as a temple is a place treated with utmost respect and many travel long journeys to go to worship, so too does it seem the writer believes a library is equally as important. There is the same respect and same need for a library as there is for a place of worship. This shows the importance of libraries due to a common need for them. We've linked back to the question because it's the importance of libraries. I've mentioned this in my last step. The final task, task 3. Now that we've had some practice with imagery questions, I highly recommend that you go on the SQA website and attempt some analysis questions yourself, focusing solely on imagery. I recommend looking at past paper 2016 to do this. Well done for revising imagery. Hopefully this has helped a lot. This brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for listening along and partaking in the revision tasks. I hope this has helped you understand imagery questions a little bit better, as well as how to lay out language questions. Please remember to give this video a like, subscribe for more revision content, and I hope you have an excellent week.